The ending of Red Dead 2 delivers one of the most epic missions in video game history. A legendary soundtrack, a massive shootout, the death of Micah Bell, and most importantly, the Blackwater money. The $150,000 stolen during the heist that destroyed the Van der Linde gang. Years after the escape, Dutch and Micah finally recovered that fortune. But at the end of the mission, the money ends up split between Sadie, Charles, and John Marston, with John alone getting $20,000. And that's way more money than it sounds. Adjusted for inflation at the time, that fortune would be worth close to $700,000 today. In other words, John Marston finished Red Dead 2 as an extremely wealthy man. There's just one problem. 4 years later, during the events of Red Dead 1, that money is simply gone. John's living like an ordinary farmer, no luxuries, no fortune, no sign of the Blackwater cash. So what happened to John Marston's $20,000? Did he really blow it all, or is there a darker hidden explanation between the two games? Today I'm gonna show you the main community theories explaining where that money disappeared to, including one of the least known ones involving John Marston's deceased daughter. Yep, John had a daughter after Red Dead 2 and almost nobody knows about it, so without further ado, let's get into the video. Near the end of Red Dead 2, John made a lot of noise hunting down criminals with Sadie, including Micah himself. This left a long trail of evidence for Edgar Ross and his new partner Archer Fordham. They quickly tracked John to his ranch in Great Plains. This allowed the ex-Pinkerton, now an agent of the newly formed FBI, to use John to do the dirty work for him, hunting down the last major outlaws of the old American West, Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and Dutch van der Linde. The government needed this outlaw trio taken out so that then-Senator and Governor candidate Nate Johns could fulfill his campaign promise to wipe out crime in the state. John obviously wouldn't take on this mercenary role willingly. That's why Edgar Ross had to take a series of measures to convince John to hunt down his former gangmates. The first step was to confiscate his ranch in Great Plains. If you visit the place before we kill Dutch, you'll see the ranch is empty with the house's doors boarded up. The second was kidnapping John's family. Edgar Ross restricted Abigail and Jack's freedom, sending them to a government institution in Great Plains where they stayed imprisoned during the beginning of the story. Those two reasons alone would have been enough for John to agree to do Ross's dirty work. But this is where the $20,000 John earned at the end of Red Dead 2 comes into play. Like I said in the intro, that amount would have been more than enough for John and the entire Marston bloodline to never have to work a single day again. With that money in hand, he had power and independence, able to just take his family and move abroad, escaping America and living peacefully in another country with Abigail and Jack. That's why, for the plan to work, the government would need to confiscate that money. And this is where the first theory about what happened to the 20 grand comes in. It was seized by the federal government under the excuse that it was criminal evidence that needed to be returned to the public coffers. Ross knew where that money came from. He knew it was the result of crime. So the government had all the legal grounds to confiscate the funds and weaken John, making the twisted plan to turn John Marston into a bounty hunter finally possible. This theory is one of the most accepted by the community because it makes perfect narrative sense and fills most of the gaps left by the story. But it's far from the only theory. I'm actually more of a fan of the last theory in this video. But before talking about that, we need to cover theory number 2. With the intention of getting his beloved wife back and finally getting his life together, John decides to buy a ranch near Blackwater, the tedious Beecher's Hope homestead. And I say tedious because buying property in 1907 was a real nightmare. Wages were extremely low while land prices stayed insanely high. And this is exactly where the second theory about John's fortune disappearing comes from. According to part of the community, John burned through the $20,000 trying to build his new life at Beecher's Hope. And honestly, this theory seems pretty plausible at first glance, especially since the first game shows John taking on a massive debt with the bank to buy the property. But does this loan really explain the complete disappearance of his fortune by the events of Red Dead 1? Well, let's look at the numbers. And to figure that out, I used the game's own missions, John's journal, and the community's comments as sources. By cross-referencing all this info, I pretty much uncovered every expense John had while building Beecher's Hope. Buying the land cost $465, and that might not sound like much by today's standards. But adjusted for inflation, that would be roughly $16,000 today. And after buying the land, John still had to invest in building the main house. For that, he bought a complete pre-cut structure in Blackwater, dropping a whopping $892. So just the house cost more than double what he paid for the land. Besides that, John also invested in building the barn, tools, work materials, and all the basic infrastructure needed to keep the ranch running. Adding it all up, these costs added another $334 to the expenses, and in the end, Beecher's Hope cost roughly $1,600 in total, including the house, the barn, and even the small gazebo next to the property. Now here's a super important detail to understand the weight of that amount. In 1907, an average worker made somewhere between 22 and 26 cents per hour. That means most Americans earned around $400 to $800 a year. And putting it simply, a regular person would need about 3 full years to pay off a ranch that expensive. That's considering gross salary, okay? Because if we factor in food, clothes, transportation, and basic living costs, that time easily goes past 5 years. But despite all this economic context, there's a huge problem with this theory. When we compare the $1,000 to $1,700 spent on the ranch to the $20,000 John got from Mount Hagen, the amount spent becomes relatively small. In practice, Beecher's Hope only took up about 8.5% of John's fortune, meaning even after paying off all the property debts, John would still have around $18,300 left in his account. Such a high amount that theoretically would be enough to support the Marston family for decades. But there's an even more important detail that a lot of people just forget. John didn't even need to use his $20,000 to pay off Beecher's Hope. This becomes clear in the final dialogue of the mission, American Venom. On top of the hill overlooking the ranch after the credits, John tells Abigail he paid off all the debt using the money recovered from Micah and Danch. And if you check John's bank balance right after the mission, you'll see he still has the full $20,000 intact in his account. So in practice, John probably left Mount Hagen with more money than we thought. Taking all these facts into account, the theory that John lost his entire fortune just by buying the ranch simply doesn't hold up. But that doesn't mean Beecher's Hope is innocent in this story. Remember when I said the place was boring and I wasn't even talking about the invaders occupying the property at the time of purchase? The real problem was the land itself. The soil in the area was extremely dry, rocky, and poor, making Beecher's Hope way more suited for raising livestock than large-scale farming. And maybe that's exactly where the 20 grand started slowly disappearing, because keeping a ranch alive on unproductive land costs money, lots of money. Without efficient farming, John had to rely almost entirely on the animals to keep the property financially afloat. But this created an almost endless chain of new expenses. Cattle got sick, horses ran off, and animals were constantly attacked by wolves, coyotes, and mountain lions in the area. On top of that, during drought periods, the natural pasture itself might not have been enough to feed the herd, forcing John to spend even more money buying feed and supplies from outside. And there's another super important detail in this story. John Marston was never a countryman. He was a gunslinger desperately trying to play the role of a farmer, and the weirdest part is that even after 4 years living at Beecher's Hope, John still didn't seem to have mastered the basic tasks of rural life. During the events of Red Dead 1, for example, we see Bonnie McFarlane teaching John himself how to herd cattle and even tame wild horses, things considered basic for any experienced rancher of the time. In other words, even years after officially leaving the outlaw life behind, John still seemed way more comfortable holding a revolver than managing a farm. And that only strengthens the idea that Beecher's Hope was never a venture meant to turn a profit, because at the end of the day, John wasn't a professional farmer building a rural empire. He was just an ex-criminal trying to keep alive a dream that might have been doomed from the start. And the problem is that romanticizing life on the farm is way easier than actually making it work, especially on an isolated property built on cheap land precisely because almost no one wanted to live there. Besides that, the ranch required constant upkeep. Fences would break, tools needed replacing, the barn needed frequent repairs, the wagons demanded new parts, not to mention ammo, horseshoes, lanterns, trips to Blackwater, and all the costs necessary to keep a whole family living out there. And there's a super important point that hardly anyone notices. At no point does Beecher's Hope actually seem profitable. In fact, everything points exactly the other way. In 1907, you still see animals scattered around the property and even a small farming project near the barn. But by 1911, during the events of Red Dead 1, the situation is completely different. John has pretty much given up on trying to farm that land. There isn't even a single relevant crop growing there. Plus, the number of animals looks way lower than what we see in the Red Dead 2 epilogue. All of this suggests that over the 4 years between the two games, Beecher's Hope went through a slow process of financial decline, and maybe this theory explains part of the mystery. Over the years, John probably spent a huge chunk of his fortune trying to keep Beecher's Hope running. The ranch clearly didn't thrive like he thought it would. By 1911, the property already seems to be going through a slow financial downfall. So yeah, I really believe Beecher's Hope ate up a big part of the Blackwater money. But in my opinion, the real answer lies in the third theory, because it kind of acts like an evolution of the previous one, a hybrid between the ranch's financial failure and a super important part of the Marston family story, a dark detail in the lore that almost never gets talked about in the community, something so subtle that most players don't even know what happened: the death of John and Abigail's daughter. And maybe that's the real missing piece to understanding the fate of the Blackwater money. The detail that almost no one knows about, it's very likely you don't know this, and honestly, it's not really your fault. A lot of players just didn't pay attention and missed one of the most tragic details in the entire Marston family lore. John and Abigail had a daughter, and the weirdest part is that the game pretty much hides this from the player. The girl never shows up, we never find out her name, we never see her face, and the game never actually explains exactly how she died. All that exists are small mentions scattered throughout the campaign. The first one happens during a mission in a conversation with Bonnie McFarlane, when John briefly talks about his late daughter.
Miss McFarlane, I'm married. I have a son. I had a daughter, but she died. Years before that, I rode in a gang.
Later on, there's a really melancholic moment during another mission when John talks to Luisa Fortuna.
Do you have children, Mr. Marston?
I have a son at home and a daughter in heaven.
Is he looking after your wife?
I hope so. He's not much younger than you, but I don't know. He's still young. We tried to protect him, give him a gentler childhood than what we had. Guess I failed at that.
What is his name?
Jack Marston. I ain't been much of a father. We tried to hide the bad from him growing up, but he saw things he shouldn't.
These are pretty much the only moments the girl is mentioned throughout the entire game. The rest of the story just disappears. And maybe that's exactly what makes this theory so creepy, because it feels like something important happened to the Marston family while the player wasn't looking. Between the hopeful ending of Red Dead 2 and the melancholic beginning of Red Dead 1, there's a 4-year gap, and it's during that time that John's daughter died. But there's another really strange detail. Inside the attic of Beecher's Hope, next to some abandoned boxes, we can find a small newborn cradle, an object almost nobody pays attention to during gameplay. In fact, this might explain why the room right across from Jack's ended up being used as a storage room in 1911. That was probably John's unnamed daughter's room, and the cradle used to be there. About her name, there's actually a pretty interesting theory from the community. According to some players, her name would be Rachel, the same name as John's mare during the Red Dead 2 epilogue. I know it sounds funny, but the theory suggests that John had already been holding onto that name for his future daughter for a long time, and ended up using it for the horse after the tragedy. And yes, I say future daughter because everything points to her being planned. What points to that is a super rare event at Beecher's Hope where John finds Abigail sewing in the living room.
Darling,
How do?
what are you knitting?
Oh, you'll see.
Be nice to have someone new to knit for one day.
Thanks, John.
As you can tell, Abigail is sewing something small, something that could very well be baby clothes. The dialogue is pretty open, but both John and Abigail imply they want to grow their family. In fact, at one point, John mentions that he'd love to have one more person living on the ranch. Honestly, in my opinion, Rockstar probably left John's daughter's story open in the first Red Dead, exactly to keep a blank page to explore later in the second game. The problem is, a lot of the epilogue content was cut during development, so there's a good chance this tragedy was one of the stories Rockstar removed. Now we get to the most important part of this theory. What does all of this have to do with the money from Blackwater? Well, maybe everything. According to this theory, John was already starting to fall into financial decline because of the failure of Beecher's Hope. The ranch wasn't thriving, the land was poor, and expenses kept rising. Then came the final blow, his daughter's illness. The game never exactly reveals the cause of her death, but considering the times, it's very likely she suffered from some common early 20th century disease, like pneumonia, typhoid fever, or scarlet fever. Diseases that seem relatively simple today, but back in 1907 could easily wipe out an entire family, especially in isolated rural areas like the Great Plains. And we need to remember one very important thing. The year was 1907. Modern antibiotics and vaccines basically didn't exist. IV serum wasn't a thing. Rural hospitals were extremely basic. Medicine back then was expensive, limited, and ineffective. And maybe this is exactly where John Marston lost it all, because even with money, he might simply not have had access to the care needed to save his own daughter. So just imagine the situation. Beecher's Hope slowly failing, expenses rising, fortune shrinking, and in the middle of all that, John desperately trying to save his own daughter, spending money on doctors, medicines, travel, treatments, hospitals, clinging to whatever hope was left. But in the end, none of it stopped the worst from happening. And honestly, to me, this is the theory that makes the most sense, because it works almost like a hybrid of the previous theory. The ranch's financial failure explains part of the Marstons' downfall, but the daughter's death would be the real event that completely destroyed that family emotionally and financially, and maybe that perfectly explains why John from Red Dead 1 feels so different from the man we saw in the epilogue of the second game. More tired, more melancholy, more empty, like something important died inside him long before Ross showed up again. And honestly, maybe the Blackwater money never disappeared in bets, luxury luxuries or bad management. Maybe it disappeared in the most human way possible, trying to stop a tragedy John never managed to avoid. But now I want to know your opinion. Which of these theories makes the most sense to you? Did John lose everything trying to keep Beecher's hope going, or did the government take part of the fortune? Or was the death of the Marston's daughter really the event that destroyed what was left of that family? Let me know down in the comments and let's discuss. And since we're talking about Blackwater's money, have you ever stopped to think about where Dutch managed to hide a $150,000 fortune right under the authorities' noses? During the desperate escape from Blackwater, Dutch had to stash all that cash in a hurry while the whole town was swarmed by Pinkertons, sheriffs, and bounty hunters. But even with Blackwater on full lockdown, no one ever found a single cent. So where exactly was that money hidden for almost 8 years? And more importantly, did Dutch really recover all that fortune in the epilogue, or is part of it still buried somewhere to this day? The mystery of the lost money from the Blackwater massacre still fascinates Red Dead Redemption 2 players to this day. In the next video, we'll break down all the clues, theories, and hidden details Rockstar left for us to try to uncover the true location of the legendary treasure Dutch hid. So if you want to find out the truth behind one of the biggest mysteries in Red Dead lore, just click right here by the yellow arrow, because the next video is already waiting for you. We'll catch up again in a few seconds. Big thanks and see you soon. Bye.